Reuven, Shuni, ladies and gentlemen. I was going to say distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, but the distinguished guests bit is entirely redundant because as I look around here, all of you are clearly distinguished guests. And of course, all from parts of Reuven and Shuni's life. Reuven tells me that some of you go back a very, very long way with him, and others, like myself, are more recent. But all of us are here, and I count myself especially privileged and honoured to be here for this event, honouring the extraordinary work of Reuven and honouring his 80th birthday. It's a very great pleasure always to be back in Jerusalem and to be here with friends and colleagues, because it is such a remarkable place. But on this occasion, to be here, albeit briefly, to recognise Reuven and the work that we've done together is particularly gratifying. I first got to know Reuven much later than many of you. Despite the grey beard, I'm really a young fellow altogether. And we got to know each other because a number of us had come from psychological, psychoanalytic, group analytic, and diplomatic backgrounds to try to understand what were the psychological drivers that were helping to polarize the Muslim and Western worlds. We know there's a lot of exploring of the political side of it, the religious dimensions, the economic and geopolitical pressures, but what about the psychological aspects? And three of us came together. Vamik Volkan, from a background as a Turkish Cypriot and obviously a Muslim background. Robbie Friedman from Israel here, from a Jewish background, and president of the Group Analytic Society, the Global Analytic Society. And myself from a Christian background from the UK and from Northern Ireland. And as we began to look at who were the people who could really enrich our understanding of these issues, very quickly, Reuven's name was brought forward. And from the very beginning, he was a very enthusiastic and enriching component of the work of IDI. I always make it a practice to be very careful about recommending political and constitutional changes to any country that I visit. It's much too easy to do so. But I have to tell you that in coming to Israel, I can see an extraordinary recommendation in the life of Reuven Merhav that you should have a House of Lords, or at the very least a Senate in Israel, which ought to be populated by, if you could find them, a number of men and women like Reuven Merhav. He reminds me very much of some of the most distinguished colleagues in the House in which I serve in the UK. Enormous experience, a groundedness not just in intellectual life, but in the practical realities of working with our difficulties and conflicts. And yet a way of describing it which is always engaging and enriching. I absolutely love it whenever Reuven starts to speak with us in some of our IDI meetings, because he inevitably takes us to places in our thinking that we would not get to without him. And I've been asked to say a little bit about where some of that thinking has taken myself. I come from Northern Ireland. I was growing up and coming up into my early teens in the late 1960s when everything was breaking down. And of course, that's the age when you're beginning to think just outside your own family circle and your own street and community, to the wider world, to the meaning of life, to what you want to do to make a difference. And just at that stage, things were beginning to break down. Everywhere in the world, of course, there were marches for civil rights in Germany, Japan, France, the United States, Britain, and in Northern Ireland. And in each situation, it took on the colouring of whatever there was the human rights or civil rights problem. And in our situation, of course, it was the difficulties between Protestants and Catholics, Unionists and Nationalists. And every week there would be a civil rights march of not just people from the Catholic nationalist community, but liberally minded people, people from the Labour Party and so on. And then there would be a counter-demonstration by people on the right, particularly led by Dr. Ian Paisley and so on. And very quickly, they would start to break down into violence, initially street violence, and then guns would start to be brought out, and then it began to get very nasty altogether. And I don't know if you can recall back, but something like that happening when you're in your early teens is at the same time frightening and exciting. It's frightening insofar as there's an adult bit of you that realizes this could be really difficult. It's exciting because there's all the buzz of something real happening. This is not just a football match. This is for real. And that's exhilarating and exciting. But it was also troubling, and it became increasingly troubling as I began to realize that this could mean a lot of hurt and damage for the community. Indeed, some of the people that I was at school with ended up being assassinated because of the role that they took in the work they were involved in. Some members of my family circle ended up in security forces and being killed or injured, and so on. So you quickly realize that people getting engaged as a community in this kind of thing were not actually operating in the best interests of the community. This was not being judged anymore on a rational judgment about socioeconomic development and benefit, because people were acting in a way that was not beneficial to them. Now, cast your mind back, or perhaps more easily, cast your mind to the next generation, or perhaps even grandchildren, and examinations. So you come up to the exam, you know that your grandchild or your son or daughter has really good chances, but they don't really work quite hard enough. They get distracted off by other things, and you know and they know the result was not as good as they could have hoped for. But next time, it will be different. And next time, it's just the same. Or they fall into a relationship, which isn't really a very good relationship. And their friends are saying, oh, get out of it. This guy's terrible for you. It'll all come to tears. And they get out of it. And you're really pleased. And then 3 months later, they're back in another relationship. And it's just the same kind of toxic relationship. So it's not the case that we all end up doing things because it's in our best rational self-interest, social interest, economic interest. And so when at that sort of stage I was reading books about political science and looking at the explanations, which at that stage were very much post-Marxian analysis of post-colonial poverty and so on, it was pretty unconvincing to me. There were lots of other parts of the world that were much poorer than Northern Ireland. There were other parts of the world that were less democratic, but they didn't have an ongoing terrorist problem of the kind that we had. So I began to think, how can one understand this? And I thought, well, if I went into medicine and psychiatry and into psychoanalysis, maybe I could come to understand why individual people did things that were damaging to themselves. And then maybe it's possible to think in the same way as an individual is a whole system of cells and organs and structures, but it's one individual. Maybe we can think of a whole community, not as lots of individual people, but as a systemic structure that is operating in a way that is not in its best interests. And so I got into political life and tried to understand what was going on. Now, one of the things that you see as essential in analysis is not just that you listen to what's going on, but that you make interventions and then you make judgments on the basis of those interventions as to whether what you've said makes sense to the patient you're engaged with. Now, you can't do that in politics. You can't put up a little board on the side of your house to say, Northern Ireland, come to me and I'll do some therapy with you. You'd be more likely to be carted off to one of the places that I used to work in, and quite rightly so. So how do you find a way of engaging? Well, the reason psychotherapy and psychoanalysis gets attention is because of a history and background of people who were able to be helpful, who were professionally trained. That creates a bit of respect. People come along and they sit down or they lie down on the couch and they speak about things. So how do you transpose that to a community as a whole? Well, you've got to get into a place where you have some access to information from the community, that you can meet with community leaders, that they're prepared to engage with you, that you can make interventions the community will hear so that it could possibly respond to it. And I thought, for me, the best way was to get involved in politics. So there I would have an opportunity to meet with political leaders and community leaders, people in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, in Britain, in other places, engage with them as leaders of their communities, respond to them, and then be able to make interventions which would be carried by the press or whatever, and see what those interventions did. What was the response? So that's what I did. And I quickly discovered if you're in a political party, unless you get to be the leader, you don't get to decide exactly what happens. So I made it my business to become the leader of one of the political parties, a party called the Alliance Party, which had both unionists and nationalists in it, people from both backgrounds. And that gave me access to go and meet with people like Prime Minister Thatcher or Charles Haughey in the Republic of Ireland, or people like Paisley or Molyneux or John Hume, or much later Gerry Adams, and to find out, to understand from them, how did their community feel? What was going on in their minds and the way that they were thinking? And a number of things became apparent to me, which might not have been apparent to me if it hadn't been for the psychological background. The first thing was how incredibly powerful history is. You know, if something happens to you a long time ago, it can still affect you now. Now, there are particular things that will affect you more than others. If, for example, we have a Q&A and I respond to you in a way which is humiliating, that puts you down, disrespects you, if you were to bump into me in 5 or 10 or 20 years' time, first thing that you will remember about me is how I made you feel. You might not even remember exactly what I said, or you might remember it very clearly. But one thing is for sure, it will be there inside. If we have a perfectly pleasant Q&A, you probably won't remember anything of it at all. But there's something very toxic about humiliation and disrespect. And when that is carried on for a lifetime in a person, it's carried on for generations and generations with communities. So if you bring a conflict to an end, like we've largely done at home, and you say to people, just draw a line onto the past, we're going to get on together, look at all the nice things that are happening, you really ought not to be surprised that it's not so easy for people to give those kinds of things up. Or if there's a deep sense of unfairness. I don't say injustice. Injustice feels too much like the law. When one of my kids, or now grandkids, will come to me, they don't say, Daddy, Stephen was unjust to me. They say, Daddy, it's not fair. It comes from in here. It's not about whether the rules were broken or not broken. The rules may be kept, but the sense of deep unfairness is just as strong. In fact, it's almost stronger because the rules didn't protect me from the unfairness. And everywhere I've gone in the world, if there's been a long-running conflict, a terrorist campaign, I've always found at least one community that feels it was humiliated and disrespected and treated unfairly. And sometimes, in fact, quite often in the most intractable ones, I find both sides feel that they've been humiliated and disrespected and a history of being treated unfairly. But it's usually each side is only conscious of their humiliation and the injustice and unfairness to them. They find it very difficult to see the other guys. It reminds me of, I used to watch cowboy and Indian films when I was a little fellow. And you know, the cowboys all had names. They had wishes, they had families, they had friends, they had ambitions. They were people. The Indians were just Indians. You didn't know their names. They were scalps. There was no real people and personality there. And that's one of the great difficulties of our relationships in groups. We find it quite difficult to see the people in another community as quite as human as us. It's a real challenge. And if it's a community in conflict, it's incredibly difficult. One of the problems, for example, for somebody that tries to come in and help people in conflict, whether in my own situation or anywhere else, is you automatically come in and very quickly find yourself attracted and identifying with one side of the conflict. It's very difficult to contain both sides. You know what it's like when the kids come to you. You love both of them. But which one was right? Which one started it? Which one didn't? Well, sometimes you say, well, it's always Billy that starts it. But maybe Annie tweaks his tail a bit. So you've got to hold onto it, contain it, and try to find a way you better the relationship in the family to deal with these problems. That's really difficult to do with long-standing historic feuds. But the first step is in recognizing that that's what they are. What are they? The problem that we had was a historic, disturbed set of relationships between groups of people. It wasn't fundamentally a constitutional mistake. It wasn't simply that people had behaved badly in the past. It was that we had disturbed relationships historically. And if we were going to deal with them, We needed to identify the relationships, we needed to structure a peace process that addressed those relationships, and we needed to understand the psychology of the large groups behind it. So that's what we did. If we're going to have a relationship between Protestants and Catholics resolved, we needed that strand with the parties in Northern Ireland together. If we were going to deal with the North-South problem, we needed the representatives of the parties in the North and the parties in the South. If it was about Britain and Ireland, it was London and Dublin governments and not the parties in Northern Ireland. And indeed, it did involve people from outside Northern Ireland. We would never have resolved our problems if we'd only had the Unionists and Nationalists engaging together. There are external stakeholders in all of these problems that you need to engage. I learned from my psychiatry that if a couple of parents bring along a child, for example, a girl with anorexia or something of that kind, and they say, everything in the family is absolutely perfect. It's just this little problem of our daughter with anorexia. You inevitably find that that is a problem, and it's a very difficult problem, but it isn't the only problem. And there are other things that you need to explore to begin to resolve that problem. And so it was with us. London and Dublin would say, it's terrible, you know. These Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, if only they just sat down over a cup of tea like us, the problems would be all solved in no time at all. But of course it wasn't the truth. And London and Dublin both played their part too. They played their part in historic terms. And when you run into difficulties, even if you've made progress in relationships, you fall back into those old historic things. And it's very clear that you can fall back hundreds of years in a matter of days. Nobody in Britain cared about the Falkland Islands until the Argentinians decided they cared about them. And then suddenly, we were able to spend huge amounts of blood and money in a part of the world most of our people didn't know existed. Suddenly you're right back into old ways of operating, old ways of functioning, old imperial ways, for example, in our situation. Second way that you need to understand in psychiatry is that the way people think changes when they fall into difficulties. If I talk on too long and you go to sleep, you might even dream. It's okay to sleep, just don't snore while you're doing it. But you may dream, and when you dream, your brain is still functioning. You're still thinking. It's just a different set of rules. If, for example, you're wide awake, you will know that if there's something nasty outside and they close the door, it could keep it out. But if you're having a bad dream, closing the door doesn't keep the monster out. In your dreams, your wishes come true and your fears come true. And the way you think is quite different. One person in a dream may represent lots of different people. Lots of different people in the dream may represent different aspects of one person. In other words, the boundaries are broken up. That's one of the things that becomes a big issue when your community feels under conflict. Who is in and who is out? Who is part of our community and who isn't part of our community? We need to set down boundaries. We need to be clear. We can't allow things to move around too much. And the way we think about things changes. We no longer are rational actors operating on socioeconomic and power benefits. We become devoted actors operating on the basis of sacred values. This city is a sacred value, not just for Jews and Muslims, but for Christian communities all around the world. They are also stakeholders in this city, not because of its socio-economic status, not because it's a great industrial centre, which thankfully it isn't, though it could probably do with more commercial and economic improvement. But again, that might well be more possible if people from outside were able to play their role more fully in it. But the point is, it has massive emotional benefit and value to people. The problem with sacred values is people are often prepared to give their lives and take other lives because of how they feel about that. And no amount of arguing about whether it's socioeconomically beneficial makes any difference. In fact, on the contrary, more financial benefit may make the situation worse. You know, if I say to you, rather fancy your wife, I'll give you £1,000 for it, you probably hit me. In fact, I think she'd be disappointed if you didn't. But if I then turn around and say, I'm sorry, that was an insult, I'll give you £50,000 for her, then you will hit me, or you ought to. Because you say, well, what kind of a guy do you think I am? What kind of relationship do you think this is? And yet, when it comes to important things in the lives of our communities, we imagine that they can be resolved by saying, if that's not enough money, I'll give you a little bit more. But that's not the way it works. It can actually make people feel worse and more angry and frustrated if they've offered economic benefit for something which is a transcendent value. No matter how much money would be offered to the state of Israel for people to relocate to somewhere else pleasant and forget about Jerusalem, it's not on the agenda. And if you come back and offer more, it only shows you don't understand. And that's true for all communities. It's not just true for this community. It's true for all communities. And so when we're dealing with these sorts of problems, we have to find ways where we're not trying to buy each other off on things that can't be bought off. I'll need to draw it to a close because there are many much more interesting things to speak about later on. But what has struck me about the work that we've been engaged with in the IDI that Reuven's been involved in, and Robbie's been involved in, and other colleagues who are here, Hiba, who you will hear from later on, and other colleagues who are not here, is that we've tried to take seriously these things that have real meaning for people. You can't measure them in socioeconomic terms. You can't deal with them in socioeconomic terms. But the most important thing for all of us in our lives is our relationships with each other, with our friends, with our families and communities, with the transcendent. These relationships are the things that make life important and sometimes make death imperative. And it's finding a way of dealing with those that is the stuff of psychology and identity and ultimately of finding peace, stability, and reconciliation in any community, even in the tough neighborhood you live in. Thank you.
I just wanted to thank you and tell you that you brought to me today the second instant of optimism. The first time was when I entered Tel Aviv, congested Tel Aviv, and I was met by a sign which said, He'ata b'shalom, slow down towards peace. It's an exit. And I was very happy because I thought that peace was frozen completely. And slow down is progress, isn't it? Now what you tell us also makes me optimistic and also tells me that maybe we have a future. A Texan who visited Israel many years ago, looking at the political mayhem we have, said, well, all you really need is a good sheriff and a good mayor. And now it comes to me that all we need here is a good psychiatrist. No personal reference intended. Let me just give you a small token of our appreciation, and if you will read this.
Dear Lord Alderdice, from this unique city with its spiritual background and rich history, we thank you for coming here and sharing with us your ideas and experience in forging a future of peace and reconciliation. Let us pray together for a Jerusalem of peace and harmony, with warmest regards to the Jerusalem Institute.